So I've been thinking to myself, what should this week's video be about? How about we talk about some boa constrictors? This right here is Ka. He turns 1 year old next month in April. He is a classic jungle boa. All of the boa constrictors that we have are called BCI Boas, also often referred to as Colombian boas or the common red tail sometimes. They're not true red tails. True red tails get very, very large. When it comes to size, these are not going to, especially males, get too big to deal with, but female BCIs can still reach some pretty crazy lengths. Most of the time males are going to be between 6 and 8 feet fully grown, and they usually mature within 18 months. Females can, usually the range is between 7 and 12 feet for female fully grown boa constrictors, BCI boa constrictors. The females get a lot bigger than the males. They're sexually dimorphic. A lot of snakes are. Males mature faster than females, so they will continue to grow for a few years. They say when it comes to breeding, you want your females to at least be between 3 and 4 years old. You don't want to start breeding a female boa at 2 years old. I'm sure there's people out there that do it, but the rule of thumb is that you want to wait until the female boa constrictor definitely gets between 3 and 4 years old, because it takes a huge toll on their body. Because if you weren't aware, boas give live birth. They are not like pythons, which lay eggs. That's a difference between the two, if you want to remember that. The male boa constrictors, it's almost like ball pythons. You know, the male ball pythons don't have to be as old and mature or as big as the female ball pythons to start breeding, but when it comes to female snakes of any species, you want to make sure that they are at the appropriate age and the appropriate body condition and weight before you start breeding. As far as pricing goes for these snakes, you'll find them a lot at reptile shows. As far as availability, boa constrictors are everywhere. You can find them online through Morph Market. You can search specific breeders online and order through them. But the price point varies. It depends on if you're going to go with a common, like this is just a classic jungle, so he costs around $250 at a reptile show. You can find some boa constrictors for a little bit less, but it's basically going to be wild type, not really going to be any crazy colors or patterns or anything like that if you're wanting to look for something that's $200 and below. Comes to Ka here and his morph, the jungle morph. If you can notice, he has these really, really cool saddles. These big patches of pattern on his back are called saddles. To turn the camera around so that you could see better, but he's got some really nice speckling, and I really loved the saddles on him. Important thing you want to remember if you do want to breed boas one day, that's something that you're passionate about, something that you want to get into. You want to try and remember when it comes to morphs, it's the same exact thing with ball pythons. You've got certain genes that you don't need to be breeding together because genetic issues can arise. Some gene combos can be fatal. When it comes to jungle, you usually don't want to try and pair jungle with jungle. You can pair jungle with other things. So Ka can be paired with a lot of different morphs, but they can't be jungle. And there are people that do it, but the running argument is that jungle and jungle together, the babies don't thrive and they usually don't live as long. So that's a pairing that you kind of want to remember not to put together. But yeah, you don't want to pair certain morphs of boa constrictors together because you want to be ethical as a breeder. You want to be responsible. You don't want to create a clutch of babies or a litter of babies that's going to have any issues. You want to try and avoid that to the best of your ability. Got some recessive boa constrictor morphs that you can work with. This is actually what you would probably consider with the ball pythons being like a co-dominant morph. Compare him with something else and it will most likely have jungle in it, because jungle is not a recessive. You can build like building blocks with like jungle and some of the other more common genes, like hypo. We have Harley, she's a hypo harlequin boa, and we're gonna actually pair them two one day, her and Ka. And since she's a hypo harlequin and Ka is a jungle, we can possibly get some hypo harlequin jungle babies, and that's a really, really cool morph. If you haven't seen one of those, I highly suggest you look those up because they're really awesome. Now I have Harley out. She is, like I said, our hypo harlequin boa, BCI. He is coming up on 2 years old next month. This is an example, sort of how big a female will be around once they reach about 2 years old. So you can imagine in another year or two, when she's between 3 and 4, how much bigger she will be. She's already pushing 3 feet as it is. And like I said earlier, female boa constrictors, BCI, they can get between 7 and 12 feet, sometimes up to 14 feet in captivity. I think it's really rare, but it can happen. Since I have her out, I want to talk a little bit about temperament, and I want to also talk about, when it comes to size, what you need to think about if you're going to own one of these guys. Right now at her size, she's super easy to handle, super, tame. I've held her ever since we've gotten her. Obviously at this size, she's super easy to handle, super easy to maintain, but when she does get fully grown, you want to keep in mind, snakes that get to a larger size, pushing 10 feet or more, you want to always have an adult present in the room if you're going to hold one of these guys, even if you're an adult, because boa constrictors can wrap around you pretty tightly, and you don't want to risk them wrapping around your neck, or you getting an accidental bite from a food response and not being able to unwrap the snake. So that's something very important to think about. As of right now, she would be completely fine around my neck. She's still very small, but when she does get to be her adult size, I would need my husband or another adult around that knew what to do in the event that she did wrap around me too tightly. They're awesome snakes. If you start handling them as babies and get them used to you, you'll have a really good outcome. A lot of boa constrictors can be, notorious for having a bad attitude or being just defensive. The snakes never really have a bad attitude. They can just be defensive. But that is where the snake hook comes in. Actually go and look at a lot of my other videos where I talk about snake behavior when it comes to different types of snakes and body language and how to handle, because I go over a lot of the hook training techniques in those videos. When it comes to the food response of a boa constrictor, you always have to remember that they would eat for you anytime you pretty much offered them something. So that's why hook training is very important, because you want to make sure that when you are approaching the enclosure and you're going to get your snake out, that it's not going to confuse your hand with food. They sense heat from your hand if you just stick your hand in front of their face. And so what the metal snake hook does, when you reach in there with it and you gently touch them on the head, it's cold and it doesn't register any heat, and it lets them know that it's not time to eat, and they will recognize this pattern, this routine, and they will not associate what you're doing with food, and then you can safely pick them up from behind. I never, even after I've used the hook and I've established that it's not time to eat, I never put my hand in their face. That's something that I do not do, especially with boa constrictors and our reticulated pythons, because I know that these two species of snakes have a very good food response. That is just something that I personally do not do, and I pay attention very closely when I'm handling them. When it comes to your husbandry inside of your boa constrictor enclosure, you want the humidity to be somewhere between 60 and 70%. If you do any research about where they come from, you'll see what the humidity is like there out in the wild. Also, when it comes to their heating requirements, you want a temperature gradient between 82 degrees and 90 degrees. You want their hot spot to be around 90 degrees. And you want the warmer side of the tank to be around there, but then you want the gradient, you don't want to really go below the low 80s. So you want to have that gradient. You want them to be able to choose where to go inside the enclosure. That's really important. Honestly, some people in PVC enclosures, they will keep boa constrictors on newspaper, paper towel, packing paper, things like that. Especially a lot of breeders, they might keep a boa constrictor on something simple like that for ease of maintenance. As far as substrate, there's a lot of different substrates that people will use for boa constrictors. You can use forest floor is a popular one. Cypress mulch, you can use reptibark, you can use, some people I've seen use cocoa husk. There's a lot of different options when it comes to substrate. You also want to provide them with a cool hide and a warm hide on either side of the tank. So another good idea is to provide them with things to climb on. They really enjoy enrichment. Provide them with plenty of branches, plants, whether you're going to do bioactive or fake plants. Provide them plenty of places to climb and hide and enjoy like they would in the wild. Younger boa constrictors tend to be semi-arboreal, which means they like to get up in the trees and climb a lot. Then once boa constrictors reach adulthood, they tend to be more terrestrial because they end up being a more heavy-bodied snake and spend more of their time on the ground. Boa constrictors do have a tendency to grow really fast, so you do want to be careful when you're feeding. You don't want to feed too often, and you don't want to feed meals that are too large. You especially don't want to feed meals that are too large too often. A thing called power feeding that you'll see some people do with their boa constrictors. This is really not healthy for the snake. It's better for you to feed them an appropriate sized meal, the appropriate time. You can do once weekly with young ones, but you need to make sure that the meal is an appropriate size. You don't want it to be too big. Most people recommend between 7 to 10 days, even for baby juvenile boas, because you don't want them to get too big on you too quickly. I highly suggest, when you're thinking about getting a boa constrictor, whether you want to get into breeding or not, or just want to own one as a pet, I would highly suggest doing a lot of research, making sure that it's something you're up for, because even though these snakes start out really small as babies, they get really big compared to a lot of the other popular smaller pet snakes like ball pythons, corn snakes, etc. So you want to be prepared, especially if you're going to get a female BCI. Like I said, they can top out between 7 and 12 feet. Some people say they can get up to 14 feet. If you're that worried about size and length, you might want to go with a male that stays a little bit on the smaller side. And then you're also going to have to think about enclosure size. You can start a baby boa in something as small as a 20-gallon. Some people say you can start one in something as small as a 10-gallon. I'm sure plenty of people do it. I started mine in a 20-gallon, and then when they start coming up on a year or two, you want to really start thinking about upgrading them to at least a 4x2 enclosure, or a 4-foot by 2-foot enclosure. And then for their final enclosure, most boa constrictors do okay with a 6-foot by 2-foot enclosure. But like I said, when it comes to some of those females that might top out at between 12 to 14 feet, you might need to do another upgrade later to an 8x2 enclosure, so an 8-foot by 2-foot enclosure. So keep that in mind if you're considering a boa constrictor. Like I said, they are fantastic pets. They get to an impressive size. They have an awesome temperament if you handle them and hand tame them. Well, that's it for this week's video. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you also have not followed us on Instagram, we are at magic_city_morphs. We post daily content on there. So if you're wanting to see more than just once weekly, please go follow us on Instagram.